Well, we all knew it was coming. People keep being surprised that I've correctly predicted which missing episode animation projects we'd get next, but that's not impressive. My predictions are based on just what makes sense, because simple base Under Siege episodes with limited casts are much easier to animate than some of the more elaborate historical ones. Yeah, chances of us seeing a Marco Polo or a Massacre animation anytime soon are pretty slim, as are the chances of anyone signing on to dedicate a significant chunk of their lives to animating the Space Pirates. Honestly, if they did that, who would even buy it? But Fury and Evil of the Daleks are the last easy ones left to do that, importantly, people would probably buy. Unlike, say, Underwater Menace, which I still have not been asked to buy a copy of. Yeah, totally understand why no one could be bothered animating that one. After they did the slightly less popular Macroterror and Faceless ones, it was always going to be down to a coin flip between these two to do next, and deciding to do Fury was always going to make me worried because I often cite it as my favourite serial ever. And I knew going in that an attempted recreation of it would inevitably end with me seeing the story in a different light, because the version of Fury from the Deep that we've had all these years is an entirely different experience to the original because it was presented in a different context. The soundtrack to Fury from the Deep made a huge impact on me as a kid, terrified the shit out of me, and was probably what initially formed my taste for weird, harsh, disturbing electronic music. Fury's soundtrack is so moody, atmospheric, strange and disturbing, and your imagination can take that stimuli and build an experience that's unique, personal, and most likely is a very different experience to the ones that kids actually got in 1968. Because here's the thing, adding visuals to a previously visualless story has changed my view of said story every single time that it's happened before. I always used to think that Enemy of the World was boring and rubbish, then it got recovered and I found myself viewing it in a different light because of its beautiful cinematography. And on the other end of the scale, I have to admit, I kinda zoned out of Power of the Daleks back in 2016 because the animation was a bit clunky and it didn't really compare to my experience reading the novelization when I was a kid. So while I spent much of my teenage years of fandom relenting the fact that Fury got junked and we're probably never going to see the real thing, I did have a sneaking suspicion that if I was actually handed a full-on version of it with visuals, it would probably end up being a Tomb of the Cybermen situation. It develops this mythical status while we've only got the soundtrack, it gets recovered, and then everyone is disappointed when comparing it to the images conjured by your imagination combined with the soundtrack of people screaming. Oh, so the cyber controller looks like a massive sentient dildo. Yeah. And unfortunately, that's exactly what's happened here. Fraser Hines' linking narration is deeply embedded into my already established experience with Fury. The narration is beautifully written and paints a vivid picture. It's slow, creepy, and takes its time building up to its moments of horror. Without it, and with the replacement visuals in place, this sequence here of Maggie seeing the first signs of the weed outside doesn't really creep up on you. All of a sudden it's outside, all of a sudden she's seeing it, all of a sudden she's screaming. The linking narration was like these slow, crawling tendrils weaving their way through the original soundtrack. Thematically, the way the narration's written and delivered meshes so well with the story that I can't really imagine Fury without it at this point. I'm not going to pretend the thematic link was why I was so blown away by it when I was a kid, of course. This is just a dimension I appreciate in hindsight. But the way the narration controlled the pace of the action and set the scene was why it always worked so well for me. And the animation sets the scene in a completely different way, and I just didn't get the same sense of visceral, spine-chilling, creeping terror from it. Another issue is that when a clip from a missing episode is as famous as that surviving clip of Quill and Oak breathing the gas on Maggie, when you see it recreated in this, and it's nowhere near as good because, come on here, it couldn't be. The shot composition in the original is beautiful, the pace is perfect, those slow steps towards Maggie are perfectly timed and go so well with the music, and just that terrifying face he does is iconic. And when you see it done in the animated version, the viewer then realises, oh yeah, we're watching a recreation here, and you get taken out of the story. The Macroterror and the Faceless ones didn't have this problem at all, because although we have 2 episodes of the Faceless ones, the story's standout moments aren't anywhere nearly as deeply embedded into your average Doctor Who fan. So you can watch them and end up enjoying the story on its own merits and forget the fact we're watching something openly designed to supplement the real thing. All that this does is just serve to remind you that you're not watching the real thing. And this is about halfway through episode 2, that fourth wall gets broken pretty early on. This is the inherent problem with just the idea of doing Fury from the Deep as an animation at all. The team behind it were well and truly stuck between a rock and a hard place because its fame was working against it rather than for it. The Macroterra and the Faceless One's relative lack of fame worked in their favour. My opinion of those was only ever likely to improve with animation, whereas my opinion of Fury was already as high as it could go, so the only way it could go was down. This is not to say I'm not grateful for the animation, of course, and I am. I did have fun with it. It's a very strong story, and its base was never going to make for a bad experience. It's Fury from the Deep, a story about sentient seaweed that possesses people. I love stories that utilise everyday things that you'd never expect someone to use as a source of horror. It's something that Moffat started doing in the new series with stuff like the scary puddle or the scary Wi-Fi. There's just something inspired about that approach to me, and it really works here with these tentacles creeping across the compound possessing people. It's simple, and it probably didn't need 2 hours to play out properly, but the foundation's still solid. But I can't help continuously coming back to the animation because the aforementioned issues I had with it, which again probably have more to do with my history with the story than the quality of what's on screen, but what that meant was that I couldn't really lose myself in the story like I could before. On the quality of the animation though, God, do I hate having to bring this up given I'm releasing my final class cartoon soon. The budget for these things and the time constraints have clearly hampered this one in particular. Maybe it's because I wasn't as lost in the story as I should have been, but I did keep noticing moments where we'd cut to a wide shot while a character's still talking, or a character is conveniently turned away while speaking, which are pretty obvious shortcuts around lip-syncing all the dialogue. I don't blame the animation team for making shortcuts, by the way, just to make that clear. The only reason I bring this up is it gives me an excuse to rant about these releases having strict deadlines on them again. This is probably a strictly budget-related issue, but I have been concerned about these things being unnecessarily rushed ever since I heard stories about how the Power of the Daleks animation had arbitrary deadlines on it back in 2016. And whether this is a budget-related issue or not, you're always gonna have to temper your expectations for the finished product when you give these things strict deadlines. And given we had the Faceless Ones, Power of the Daleks Special Edition, and this all in the same year, the suggestion that they're being rushed does feel like a valid one. But I am sure that the fans buying these things would probably all prefer quality over quantity. But still, maybe we'll get a second draft in a few years like with Power. Or hell, you never know, maybe the real thing will actually get recovered in that time. Don't kid yourselves. Well, at least they haven't announced that Evil of the Daleks or Abominable Snowmen will be out in March or something stupid like that. Oh shit, I'm always right about these things. Oh god, I've probably just jinxed it, haven't I?